Our plenary speaker this morning is Amanda Randles, who is an alum of the program. She is the Alfred Winborn Mordecai and Victoria Stover Mordecai Associate Professor of Biomedical Sciences and Biomedical Engineering at Duke University. That takes a long time to say. Where she also serves as the director of the Duke Center for Computational and Digital Health Innovation. She holds courtesy appointments in mechanical engineering and material science, computer science, and mathematics, and is a member of the Duke Cancer Institute. Her research focuses on the development of patient-specific digital twin models that integrate high-performance computing, machine learning, and multi-scale biophysical simulations to enable proactive diagnosis and treatment of diseases ranging from cardiovascular disease to cancer. She has published 113 peer-reviewed papers, including in Science, Nature Biomedical Engineering, and Nature Digital Medicine, holds 121 granted U.S. patents with approximately 75 additional applications pending. Dr. Randles' contributions have been recognized with the ACM Prize in Computing, the NIH Pioneer Award, the NSF Career Award, and the ACM Grace Hopper Award, and the Jack Dongarra Early Career Award, and the inaugural Sony and Nature Women in Technology Award. She was named to HPC Wire's People to Watch list in 2025. She's a fellow of the National Academy of Inventors and has been honored as a World Economic Forum Young Scientist and one of MIT Technology Review's top 35 innovators under 35. Dr. Randles received her PhD in Applied Physics from Harvard University as a recipient of both the DOE CSGF and NSF fellowships. She has a master's in computer science from Harvard and a bachelor's in computer science and physics from Duke. Prior to graduate school, she worked as a software engineer at IBM on the Blue Gene supercomputing team. So please join me in welcoming Amanda Randles.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you all for having me. I'm very excited to talk to everybody today. So I am a fellow of the program. I think CSGF is very special. I think it's a very unique program that not just gives you funding to do the research you want to do, but really helps build the community. So I wanted, hopefully through my talk, I'll kind of try to touch on some of that and kind of how my work kind of evolved and where it came from over the last few years. So for my work, I'm really passionate about trying to figure out how we can use large-scale computing to solve problems we've never solved before, particularly in the space of healthcare. So we are trying to enable physicians to find disease faster and diagnose it easier, to track disease remotely while people go about their daily lives, and help them be able to treat the disease better so that we are able to improve human outcomes. We're doing this using a range of technology from AI to wearables. We're working with extended reality for virtual treatment planning. And of course, we're using high-performance computing and advanced computing technologies to move this forward. So kind of to anchor into what we're working on, what our team is hoping to do is to really make a paradigm shift from the status quo, where someone has some kind of symptom arise. So you exhibit chest pain, or you have shortness of breath, or you're gaining weight, or something is going on that is making you go to the doctor or to the hospital, and that doctor is going to take action, react to that event, and work to mitigate that situation. What we want to be able to do is switch this to be something more proactive so they can step in earlier and help address the situation before it progresses to that point. And that's where we really see digital twins playing a role. One example that we're working on now is for heart failure. So trying to identify different biomarkers that are changing and can be monitored using digital twins, so computational models plus wearable devices. And the hemodynamics are changing before you're actually exhibiting symptoms. So while that patient is still stable, moving about their daily lives, we want to be able to identify that there is a problem, have the doctor step in, and it may be as simple as just giving them different medication, calling them and saying to modify their exercise routine. Just give them that option to kind of step in early and say and help that patient. I need to pause and just, I know people, everybody's talking about digital twins. It has kind of a different term in different fields. So here we're talking about a digital twin being a model that is continuously updated with real-time data from their physical counterparts. For years, and probably the last like 30 years in computational fluid dynamics, if not longer, we have really worked to create these personalized models of patients that are based on electronic health record data, medical imaging data, and a digital twin is slightly different. So the digital twin is taking data continuously from potentially wearable sensors and giving this feedback loop that is continuously updating that virtual representation of the patient that's going to be informed by these types of sensors. This isn't new, and I guess it's a little hard to see here, but I'll let this rotate. The color shows a little bit better there. But engineering companies like GE have used digital twins of jet engines for years. So they feed live sensor data, they're predicting failures, and they're scheduling repairs before there's going to be a breakdown. So imagine if you can have that for the patient, where we can have some kind of check engine light for the patient the doctor can identify before anything is going to happen and step in before those health risks appear. I'll be back. And so here in the rest of the talk, I want to talk about two key examples. What I'm focused on is building a vascular digital twin. There are many different ways you can integrate a digital twin into the health side. We're purely focused on blood flow modeling, building digital twins that are patient-specific of the patient vasculature. And I'll touch on two quick examples, one that's in cardiovascular disease, and then one for cancer quickly at the end. So the first example is trying to look at cardiovascular disease, trying to create a remote virtual model of your heart so the doctor can see what's happening with your heart remotely, can track what's going on, and identify what is the best treatment for that patient. So I'm going to pause and just give you a little bit more information about myself. So you kind of heard a little bit of the update and kind of see where this kind of fits in. This is my just basic me in one slide to give you a sense. The career stuff is all at the top. The bottom is personal, just so you can see. I'll stick to the career side here, but for the fellows, if you have any questions about doing, I have twins and an older kid, any questions later about how to handle and wrangle all of that, I'm happy to answer anything, and please feel free to reach out. The key parts, which you kind of heard, is like I went to Duke for undergrad, but then I worked as a software engineer on the Blue Gene supercomputing team for a few years. While I was there, I was exposed to what high-performance computing was for the first time, and I could see the kind of questions you could answer. But I was on the development side. We were making Blue Gene and making the device itself. You weren't really the one using the Blue Gene supercomputer. And I wanted to switch over to IBM Research, where you could actually use the system. At that time, at least, to do that, you needed a PhD. So then I went back to graduate school with that as the goal. I wanted to mention that I went to supercomputing, and I'll try to throw in some of the CSGF. I imagine many of you hopefully have met Jeff Hammond. If you haven't, you should definitely meet Jeff Hammond at some point. He is currently at NVIDIA. I met him, I think, at the Krell booth at supercomputing in 2009. And the key pieces are I went up and he told me about CSGF, told me I should apply, but he didn't just give me the flyer. He actually followed up and helped me write my essays. He edited my essays and was a true advocate from there. I have now collaborated with him. I saw him the other week at ISC. It's been 20 years, and he's still a mentor and an advocate. But he is the one who first introduced me to CSGF and kind of brought me into that area. I then was very lucky in getting CSGF in 2010. I went to Harvard for my graduate school, and then pretty much a couple months after I got the CSGF fellowship, my advisor decided he wanted to leave and go to EPFL in Switzerland. And I'll also point out one piece, as you'll see at the bottom, that I got married in 2011. My husband is from Wales. We had worked very, very hard to get him into the country and into the same city as me. And then as soon as I started graduate school, my advisor was like, that's great. If you want to come to Switzerland with me, you can, which didn't go well. So that stressed me out a little bit. I didn't know what to do. I came to the CSGF meeting and legitimately, I signed up for one of the meetings with Fred Streitz, who was there. I think it was supposed to be a 20-minute meeting, and he sat with me for 4 hours to give me advice and figure out, what I should do, and kind of helped me through things. And I met with him at every CSGF meeting throughout my career. And he just was incredibly helpful, and CSGF created that support system. And it's just worth knowing, you can ask people, and they are there for you on that. I dedicated my thesis partly to Fred, because he was definitely, he was just a huge impact. And in that, having CSGF let me stay at Harvard, work remotely with my advisor, and I had a co-advisor who stepped in, and he was a graphics person, so he didn't really do anything with blood flow modeling, but he was you need a person to be with, and was just supportive. But it allowed me to continue doing the research that I really wanted to do with support through mechanisms like CSGF as I went through. So it was definitely had a huge impact for me. and allowed me to kind of create the project that I really wanted to work on and continue there and not have to leave my husband in doing so, or my boyfriend at the time in doing so. And I'll do a quick thing. The other one I really wanted to mention is kind of, and I'll come back to more later, but at the end when I was graduating from Harvard, I wanted to figure out, I loved interdisciplinary research. I really like this blend of application, and I was trying to get different jobs. I won't go into detail, but I definitely had a lot of help from CSGF contacts on trying to apply to named fellowships at the different national labs. And I was very lucky, and I kept getting to be a finalist in all of them, and then I wasn't getting them. And it's great to be a fellow, or great to be a finalist, but it didn't pay your salary, and it didn't mean that you could actually, pay rent the next month. And in the meantime, my husband had graduated and gotten a job in Boston, and I was trying to figure things out. And I think one of the days where I think one of them I ended up not getting, David Keyes happened to be giving a talk at Harvard about how amazing interdisciplinary research is. So I emailed him and it's like, you say this, but I can't get a job, and I really need help. And I don't know, when you give talks at universities, they pack your schedule and you are filled all day. He saw my email, he called, and I had met him at a dinner at CSGF. I did not know him well, and I don't know why. I think I was very struggling with like how to get a job and felt that I needed help. I reached out to him and he introduced me to people. He introduced me to people at different companies that resulted in, I had several job offers at industry. He really helped walk through what I could do and help get options. I ended up getting a Lawrence Fellowship, which I'll talk about later. Or actually, yeah, I'll talk about for a second, and that comes to Jeff in a second. I got the Lawrence Fellowship. I found out, my husband defended in March. He had his job. I only found out in April, and I was defending in May. So it was just a little bit stressful in that period of trying to figure life out. I will get back to science, I promise. But then just things to mention, my husband had gotten his job in Boston. I got the Lawrence Fellowship, which is a dream position where you get to do your own research and lead the work with top scientists at Livermore, but it's in California. So then that's where Jeff helped play a role of figuring out how I could actually balance. And I spent 2 weeks of every month in Boston, 2 weeks in Livermore. This is not a conventional setup for the Lawrence Fellow, and it really needed people to work on it and try to help figure out how to make this happen. It ended up being fantastic. I met Eric Draeger through all of this and through CSGF contacts, who ended up being my mentor. He is still someone who comes to visit Duke at least once or twice a year. We're still working very, very closely. And just as every award or many of the awards I have won, Eric is the person who nominates me. And it is you need these people kind of in your corner who are willing to help you. And I will say the ACM Prize in Computing, Eric nominated me, David Keyes wrote a letter, and it is very, the community from CSGF has been very supportive and really helpful on all of this. So with that, I will come back to the science for a few minutes. So in all of that, it allowed me to really create my own code for blood flow. We called it Harvey. I was at Harvard at the time, so part of it seemed cute. But it was also named after William Harvey, who was the first person who figured out that blood circulates. So I was really lucky where I had that autonomy to really create this code. And then because I was pretty much creating it by myself at Harvard, I was allowed to then take it with me when I left. And that's kind of what I've been working on for the last 20 years. And it was really because of a fellowship like this that really enabled me to do that work. When I went to Duke, or when I was in my PhD program, we were starting to build Harvey, which is this digital twin, kind of getting towards that path. What we needed for Harvey to be able to do that, we wanted a patient-specific, large-scale blood flow simulation. So you needed to tune it to that patient, which required using the medical imaging data. We segment that data. So segmentation, if you're not familiar, is really just going around identifying the lumen and the edges of each of the vessels. You're doing that on each stack, and then you're building up that 3D model of that patient-specific. Here, it's their coronary arteries. We're getting a triangulated STL file, like a mesh file that you're seeing on the far side here. And that allows you to create, and this is the input to the large-scale fluid dynamics simulation. So you're putting that into the supercomputer. It needs incredibly high resolution, which is why it requires large-scale computing. And then now we're trying to move it to the dynamic and continuous tracking, and really, which I'll talk about later, moving into long-term hemodynamic maps that are letting us see how someone's blood flow is evolving over time, but in 3 dimensions. I think it's important to show this video where it gives you an intuition of this is not just a data model, it is a physics-based model of someone's blood flow, and that is what we are using to get information about that patient. This video is also nice because it kind of conveys why it's so computationally intense. Just in this simulation, you're seeing about 300 million different red blood cells. They're interacting with each other, they're interacting with the fluid, and this is why we needed the large-scale supercomputers to be able to model these kinds of simulations. This video is actually pretty old. It's from 2010. It was on, I think it was on like Mirror at the time. It was on one of the biggest supercomputers at Argonne. And the interesting piece here is it took the entirety of that supercomputer for a full 6 hours just to model one single heartbeat. So it was a huge feat. It ended up being a Gordon Bell finalist, and it was great, but it got us to about one heartbeat with all of the supercomputer. And I will point out, I always say I have been showing this slide and this video in every single talk I have given since 2010. This is my fellow talk from 2013, and that is the video that I still was showing back then. When we used this tool, we were using that with Mufi, which was the predecessor to Harvey. We were then able to build Harvey targeting supercomputing. So it was meant from the ground up to be able to be scalable and work for and be extensible to use in different tools for the parallel computing side. I'll have one last comment before I move into my other research of like while my time in graduate school before I moved on, so like CSGF, as I said, had a huge impact. I will not be able to talk about everything, but I wanted to mention a few highlights of, a lot of the people that ended up impacting my career, I met at the fair where you were learning more about the different labs. They weren't necessarily associated with the program, but they were like attending the program and ended up being impactful mentors and collaborators in the future. Chris Johnson had just given one of the talks. David Richards was my practicum advisor. And then obviously like the fellows just play a key role. I think Jay was here somewhere. My first grant that I ever submitted, he thoroughly edited my Ames page, and that he's the entire reason I got that first grant. It was much, much better. If you're ever writing a grant, you should contact Jay. He's amazing at writing Ames pages. But it's like Ashley had put together when we each started faculty together, she had a monthly group where she had virtual people across the country from different universities that were all new faculty getting together for a help group and kind of having a group that you could talk to that wasn't at your institution and ask free advice on that side. And there's so many connections that can come out of CSGF that are not just your fellows, but also everything. And I want to just make sure to mention. The other one that is worth mentioning is Thomas Fay was a fellow at the same time as me. The thing that's interesting is if you looked at everything I've shown so far, it was all fluid modeling. There were no red blood cells. I guess the video so far had the red blood cell. Those red blood cells did not deform. They were just ellipsoids if you watched it. And then I came here and saw Thomas Fay's poster, and he had deforming red blood cells. And that seemed much better. So he and I spent a lot of time at this meeting discussing how would you put in, he taught me about immerse boundary. He then visited me at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute for a few days, taught me how to do it, and tried to figure out how we could get some code working. I visited him and his advisor at NYU, and it really created it took years for us to get a working red blood cell model because it is very complicated. But it was all seeded in just seeing his poster here at CSGF to start with. With that, I went to Dana-Farber and Livermore. The key pieces to know that you guys would be interesting here, while I was at Livermore, I really focused on how to scale the code. So we went from having that heart model to the first model that could really make a 3D fluid simulation on the order of the full body. So we were very focused on getting that spatial computing code, the spatial scaling complete. We worked on Sequoia at the time. So what you're seeing here is our scaling graph. I imagine most of you are very familiar with these. It's the whole, if you have 2 processors, you want it to go twice as fast. If you have 1.5 million processors, you want it to go 1.5 million times faster. And you can see, working with Eric Drager and the team at Livermore, we were able to get very close. And we had, this also was a Gordon Bell finalist in 2015. And we were able to get about, I think, 68% scaling efficiency by the time we got to 1.5 million. The other piece while I was at Livermore that was really interesting was we worked with teams through the LDRD process, which is one of their research support and granting mechanisms that I think Jeff is still leading now. And through that, we were able to support experiments to actually validate and use in vitro models to validate the model. So we worked with teams to 3D print, which is what you're seeing on the side. Using the exact same STL file that's going into the simulation, we were able to 3D print the models, run particle image velocimetry experiments, and really validate the model in a very controlled way that you can't do in biology, where we know exactly what the inflow rates are. We can set the viscosity of the fluid and really match and make sure and verify that our model is doing what we thought it should do. From there, I had a verified and scalable model, and then I moved on to Duke, and I won't go into detail, but I thought it was funny that I moved into Duke, and then down the hall was John. So I constantly had mentors along the way that were associated with CSGF, which has been really great for me as I go forward. On the science side, digital models, what I had was a scalable model, and we had it verified against this in vitro data. So what we wanted to do is really move it to the clinic. And at Duke, the nice thing is the engineering school is right across from the clinic. So we can walk over, my students can see, they'll sit in and see procedures, they see where we're getting, it's easier to get data. The doctors can come and they'll teach in my classes, and it's actually feasible because it's just across the street. So it was really nice to be able to really scale this and apply it in a way that I couldn't have done in other locations. And the first target that we were looking at was fractional flow reserve. So fractional flow reserve is just a gold standard. It's the common, if you start to have chest pain, you go to the hospital, they will put a guide wire in your coronary artery. It's an invasive guide wire. They will go in and they will simply just measure the pressure before and after your stenosis or where the plaque buildup is. It's just the ratio of those two pressures. If it's above or below 0.8, that's what decides if you get a stent or not. And that tells you how severe that stenosis is and whether it needs to be treated. What we're able to do with the digital model side is create a patient-specific flow model and then measure that FFR in the digital model and match the invasive guide wire. So you no longer need the invasive guide wires. You're able to do this use this diagnostic tool. There are many companies now, and some had started before us, that are in this space that are now FDA approved, out in the clinic, and heavily being used. So the big piece here is that you're really seeing acceptance of digital models in the clinic, and cardiologists are really on board with this and moving forward. What I think is a little more interesting is with these digital models, we can access markers that you can't directly measure with a guide wire and you can't really get to with conventional measurements. So what you're seeing here is vorticity. We did a 200-patient study that was a multi-site trial that did show we had fractional flow reserve and we were getting that accurately. But what I thought was almost more interesting was the patients that were just above 0.8, so maybe just even 0.801 or 0.802 who were not getting stents. If you tracked them long time, the ones that had higher vorticity had a higher rate of adverse events down the line, which really means we can stratify those patients earlier, and we could find the ones that are kind of in this gray zone that didn't get a stent, but maybe they should have gotten a stent, and have other markers that you can get out of these digital models to allow us to figure out which patients should really be getting those stents and improve our care in that setting. So this was more on the, we were able to find the disease better, we were able to diagnose it better, and we had these computational models that were working closer with the clinic on this stage. And the next piece is really figuring out ways to track the disease. So we wanted to be able to move it to, as someone's at home, when you're not in the clinic, how do we understand what's happening with that patient? And then luckily in this time, we're in this healthcare revolution where wearable devices are really becoming very common. It's dead now, but I'm currently wearing my Apple Watch and my Aura. I'm curious what the younger fellows are. Who has an Aura on? Only some? Okay, do you guys have Apple Watches? Does anyone have a Garmin? What do the fellows wear? Okay, Garmin is popular. I feel like there's a change. In just 2022, there were 115 million registered Apple users. This is getting, very ubiquitous. And that's just Apple Watches. If you include Garmin, you include Aura, you include your even just your smartphone getting step counts. We're suddenly getting all of this data outside of the clinic. We can access it and understand what's happening with these patients. So I think a key piece here is it was really the first time that we had a need to model longer than a couple heartbeats. So previously there was a need to match what's happening in the clinic, diagnose the patients, and now because the wearables existed, it presented this new problem of we actually want to look longer in time. In doing that, that presented several challenges because if you remember, we were able to get a heartbeat, but it took the entirety of the world's biggest supercomputer for all of 6 hours for one heartbeat. If you want to model someone's flow over 6 months or even a year, and you want to do this for every single patient, that's not very tractable. So we needed to be able to find new algorithms and new ways to kind of approach this. One piece that I thought was kind of funny is we're using parallel in time approaches. Kind of coming back to my 2013 presentation, we've been looking at this for a long time. We've been trying to figure out how to do parallel in time approaches, and pretty much like this slide where we're breaking it down and doing it temporally is really the underpinning of what we've developed in the last few years. And my last, I think, random story with that is and I don't know if Tim is still here, but so Fred Streitz invited me to a conference in Utah when I was a graduate student. Mike Minion gave a presentation on what is parallel in time approaches. I had never heard of these in any way. I had no idea what they were. And then they had an event where I just kind of cornered Tim Gurman, who I don't know why I decided he needed to explain this to me, but I think he spent probably another 4 or 5 hours working out how to apply parallel in time approaches to lattice Boltzmann and is this feasible with me? And that ended up being a big paper that I worked on in my graduate school. But since then, it's really been the underpinning of what we're doing to try to move it from wearables. So you can kind of see the same approach here as what we've developed with Cyrus, who's was one of my students at Duke and just graduated last month, where he's figured out how to drive the simulations from the wearable devices. So our inlet conditions are being modified by what we're getting out of the wearable device. And then we're splitting it up and we're defining what we're calling hemodynamic units. So we're splitting it up in parallel and time approaches. We have distinct chunks that you can then simulate in parallel and kind of stitch back together. We kind of describe it like shotgun sequencing of like you're splitting it all up, simulating each chunk and then piecing it back together. We then locked down our cluster for probably about 4 or 5 months on our part of the Duke Compute cluster. Brute force ran 750 heartbeats, which is an aside, the longest anyone had ever run before this for 3D blood flow was only 30 heartbeats. So we did I think it took about 4 months to brute force to get this model of what you're seeing here. We ran 750 heartbeats to get that ground truth, and then we used LHMF, which is this longitudinal hemodynamic mapping framework, ran it in the cloud, and we were able to get, you can kind of see like the cyan result is what we got from LHMF. The explicit was that brute force of locking down the cluster. So with significantly less computational cost, we were able to actually model up to 750 heartbeats, which is a huge change for us. Cyrus then took this further, and he modeled someone's blood flow for a full 6 weeks. So this is the first proof of concept that we could move from just a few heartbeats, which a heartbeat's about 0.7 seconds. So it's just like a few seconds to actually capturing about 6 weeks of data. And it's a little hard to tell, but you can kind of see that it's like there's a fluctuation in the color as it's going through. And what this is looking at is wall shear stress. The wall shear stress is the frictional force on the edge of the vessels, and that leads to plaque development. Like lower regions of wall shear stress make you more vulnerable for plaque development. It changes the receptors that are being expressed by your endothelial cells, and it causes disease to localize and progress in different regions. Previously, we could only take a static image or one heartbeat and have your representative resting heartbeat or your representative exercise heartbeat, and you would look at how much time you're spending or how, did you have any regions of area in a low wall shear stress. And now we're actually able to calculate how much time did you spend in these at-risk regions over 6 weeks. And then you can even go further and say prospectively, if we know this patient, let's try different exercise regimes and see what can we do. Do we give them a statin? Do we give them some kind of drug? Like what are the different techniques we can use to mitigate that and reduce the amount of time that they're actually spending in these at-risk conditions. So it's allowing us to really shift from just looking at this one snapshot of diagnosis to really capturing what's happening while they're going about their daily lives. So now we're starting up clinical studies. We're looking at carotid disease, heart failure, and like different areas with the clinicians at Duke to try to see how can we actually implement this and learn something from these devices. That is allowing us to really get to this, like the future of what we see as the digital twins. So it's this remote monitoring while you're not in the clinical office, but it is also allowing us to do things like try, different medical devices. So we can virtually place different types of stents and see, before you step in the operating room, what was the best stent for you? Give that doctor that kind of information. And it's not just based on what's going to happen tomorrow. They can say like, well, what if this person then exercises, or what if they get COVID, or what if, whatever happens and they're not, can we try different prospective options and see what's happening. I'm going to switch over. The second example is, we first were looking at bulk fluid. The next piece was looking at cancer. For cancer, it's important to remember that blood is not just a fluid. There is, it is mostly your red blood cells. You have some white blood cells kind of thrown in there, about 45% red blood cells. Obviously, there's those like biconcave discs. They are deformable, they can be sticky, you want to be able to capture all of this phenomena. If you remember, I met Thomas, he taught me all about immerse boundary method. It took me a few years. My first postdoc was an expert in immerse boundary method. He came in and really helped implement this model. He's now at Oak Ridge National Lab, so if you end up there, he is also fantastic. So we match this immerse boundary method for the red blood cells. You can kind of see the white one in the middle here is the cancer cell. We use it to model the different cancer cells. We have a finite element method for the solid mechanics, and then we're still connecting this to that underlying fluid mechanics. So you really have this multi-scale model that is allowing you to get the different components at each stage. So this video I mentioned, I did also meet Joe Inslee from Argonne at one of the events here when you're trying to figure out your practicums. He made this visualization. If you ever need visualizations, He is amazing. He leads the Viz team at Argonne. But the key of this visualization is really showing, you can see the streamlines from our fluid model. The cells are colored by the force on the different cells. But one of the other pieces is just, how much, if we want to keep the cells in all of that region, it is incredibly computationally heavy and incredibly computationally costly to get these models running. An interesting fact here, if we wanted, the grand challenge dream would be, could we run the entire body with all of the red blood cells? If you just sit down and do a back of the envelope calculation, the best we could possibly do, if we filled, at this time it was on Oak Ridge's Summit supercomputer, on all of the Summit supercomputer, the best we could do was modeling this tiny, tiny cube that's about 3.1 millimeters tall and about 3.1 millimeters around as a little cylinder, and it held about 550 million red blood cells, which is one of the largest number of simulations anyone's ever done with red blood cells, but it's still only this teeny tiny part of the body and doesn't tell you very much about where the cancer cell is moving. And the other key piece with this is, it's not just if we wait for the next biggest supercomputer, we'll be able to get there. It's a brute force approach is not going to work. So there we started working on more interesting algorithmic approaches. What we introduced, we call the adaptive physics refinement model, but it's basically just a high resolution model where around the cancer cell, you have this really high resolution model. Within that window, you have all of the red blood cells. The key piece for us is what we cared about is looking at the cancer cell trajectory and trying to understand how long the cancer cell is spending at different sites along the wall, where it's likely to cause metastasis, what the behavior is, and what is it about that cancer cell that is causing it to stay, have a longer residence time at different points. To that end, the angle of the red blood cell, 10 centimeters away, probably was not affecting, the direction that little red blood cell is going. So because of the question we were asking, we needed, all the angles of the red blood cells to know if the cancer cell hits it, depending on the angles of the red blood cells around it, it's going to change the trajectory of the cell. We needed to capture the viscosity in the fluid, and if there was a vortex down the line, you needed the bulk fluid around in the entire geometry. But we were able to kind of get away and do it's kind of like an adaptive mesh refinement, but you have the FSI model in the window and the bulk fluid outside, but very much inspired if you guys are familiar with adaptive mesh side. So basically, we have this little box that goes through the geometry. Inside the box, you have all of the cells, you have the cancer cell, and the really nice piece with this is we have the bulk fluid that typically runs on the CPU, so we're really able to make use of these heterogeneous supercomputers. You have the incredibly large bulk fluid model that we had done previously with our 2015 Gordon Bell, and then you move that with the cell model and have the GPUs being focused on the large-scale box, and you're able to get much longer time trajectories. The interesting piece, just to show that this actually works, I like this model where it shows this is just an expanded channel. The interesting part here is in the expansion. Because it's an expanded channel, you can kind of see with the trajectory, the cell is going to move upward and start to marginate towards the edge of the channel. When we did this on the bottom with our adaptive physics refinement, we saw that same trajectory and were able to recover that. The key piece to think about is if you just modeled a box, the box would not know that it was hitting an expanded channel and would not know that it should be marginating. So it shows that the coupling is actually working properly, and you really do need this overall fluid model that's the entire boundary of the domain, because you need to know that the velocity in the overall domain is getting larger. You need to understand how it's affecting it for the margination. But you also don't need all the individual, how the red blood cells are moving. And then you also do need to take into account, we don't know what the orientation of all the red blood cells are, so then it becomes an uncertainty question of what are all of the different, potential spaces of red blood cells. And this is just showing the effect. If you had many different red blood cell orientations, that's how you would see the variation and the variation across that trajectory. So there's a lot of the approaches of how do we do the mean sampling across this different space and make sure we're accurately sampling this space to make sure we know the different potential distributions of these red blood cells that allow us to use, instead of that brute force explicit fluid structure interaction model, we can switch to this moving window. And the key piece is that really allowed us, one example was just taking a much smaller window, so we weren't trying to run the full 550 million, we really just cared about what was happening for this specific cancer cell, which allowed us to go to a smaller window. And I think this ran on maybe 1 or 2 nodes in AWS. We ran it, so to get 1.5 millimeter of movement, it took about, for every block, that's 1.5 millimeters. And to go from this initial position up to here, it only took 96 hours of compute time on AWS. keep in mind when we were running on just that 3.1 millimeter distance to get that entire cube over here, that would have taken, it took the entirety of Summit, which had 4,600 nodes. So the compute hours we're able to save was extremely significant and get much longer time trajectories. The interesting piece of where we're at now is what we really care about, and I'll pause so I can kind of explain this briefly. Cancer cells stick. So when they're moving, and you can kind of see there's little yellow pieces, and we're modeling down to the scale. You can kind of see those little yellow ones as they move through. They're a little small, but it's the receptor ligand. I'll hurry. It's the receptor ligand pairing. We're getting down to the individual adhesion to understand why that cancer cell is adhering to different parts of the endothelium, which can help us understand the biomechanical processes underpinning cancer metastasis and understand why that cancer cell is moving where it is, why it's spending more time in different locations. And we're able to get to that with this moving window model in a way you wouldn't be able to with brute force, because you can hopefully appreciate in here the scale that we needed to run when we were doing the 550 million. We probably had a 9 or 10 grid point, like a 9 or 10 micron resolution, which allowed us to resolve the red blood cells. If you go down to like 4 or 5 microns, you can kind of get the deformability of red blood cells about 8 microns across. If you want to get the individual ligand receptors, you need to at least have like a micron resolution, if not much farther, to actually capture these individual ligand receptors. And you wouldn't be able to do that having that kind of, that resolution across the entire geometry at scale. So this is allowing us to really capture and reduce the memory that's required. So that's what we're showing here in this example. The explicit model would have taken 42 gigabytes, but using this approach, we're down to about 1.15 just for the window, and then the rest is out on the CPUs for about 0.6 gigabytes. So it really is allowing us to move forward and ask questions we couldn't address before. And I'll stop there. Everything I've talked about today is how we can try to bring digital twins from the cellular scale to the fluid model to really understand, we're using the cell models to improve therapeutic design, understand the underlying mechanisms of why cancer is happening in the disease orientation, up to the bulk fluid scale on the full body, where the cardiovascular case, we're really working with the clinicians and see this translating into the clinic in the nearer term future, and there's much more. There's more opportunity to directly decide, how do you design devices better? How do you improve treatment in a real-time setting? I think the digital twins, and this is just on the vascular side so far, digital twins have a huge potential. And we're really interested in trying to bring in other areas. And how do you build beyond just vascular twins? How do we bring in genetics, immunology, neurology, other kinds of behavior into these dynamic, evolving models? I mean, there's a huge potential there, and that's where now everything I do has like the very long names. We have our new Center for Computational Digital Health Innovation, where it's trying to really bring different people together to work to bring in these different types of models beyond just vascular care, to have this overall holistic ecosystem for this proactive approach for personalized digital twins. With that, I'll acknowledge all of the funding we've had over the years with that, and then as a shameless plug on all the fellows looking for postdocs, we are also always hiring, so please keep us in mind. I'll ask for questions.